Which country are you in, Peter?
There we go.
Oh, I'm in China, baby.
Are you really?
I'm in Shanghai. Been here for 30 years.
We're being live
Holy
streamed,
cow.
FYI, gents.
All right.
There we go.
No
So, I mean-
off-color language anymore, huh?
Oh, well, you just be yourself, Peter. That's the name of the game around here. But gentlemen,
Absolutely.
thank you both for joining me. Peter Alexander has been on the podcast before. Other Peter, St Onge, this is the first time. My motivations for getting this together, I mean, I don't talk too much about the macro stuff in more recent years or months, I guess. And part of that is because, basically, if you're all in on Bitcoin, what's the point? Like you're kind of just allocated, and it's fascinating, but I don't know how much it changes, allocation and investing decisions. But this particular, I'm still very fascinated in macro generally. And obviously it still has many implications for, our lives and things like that. And in particular, China, because I spent 10 years in China. Peter Alexander's been there for 30 years. And Peter St Onge, you've been commentating on this. You're an economist, Mises fellow. You've been commentating on this stuff a lot, especially lately. And the China story has become kind of interesting lately, as, the whole macro situation is interesting, but China in particular. So I wanted to get you two together today to try to see if we can collide our perspectives and come to a more accurate understanding of what's really going on there and what the implications may be. So Peter Alexander, I'll send it over to you first for a little intro and opening comments, and then St Onge, we'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Look, I mean, just to, follow up on the previous time that I was here, essentially I've been here for 30 years, just about, and it's been a wild ride. There's no doubt about it. But the thing that I found, and Peter St Onge, huge fan, by the way, and have been enjoying the commentary you've been providing for the last, handful of weeks. I don't actually disagree with a lot of what you and many others are actually commentating on. The point that I'm trying to interject today, and I've been doing for a while now, is from the standpoint of, it's not that the messages are necessarily incorrect. It's more of a point that there's a lot more underlying what's going on. And I think bringing myself in, talking about it from the standpoint of someone who's been here for a while, I've seen, Jiang Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, you name it, and having a discussion that broadens the discussion. I would just add this one point. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had over the last 3 weeks in which the comment of 20+% youth unemployment, plus the fact that China is no longer releasing that data, has come up in my daily life. And we can get into that, but it's really just to be able to try and have a conversation, broaden out the talking points, and just take it from there.
Peter, just real quick, out of curiosity, is that youth unemployment number, is that coming up in conversations with foreigners or with Chinese?
Just with the foreigners.
Okay. Because, I guess, John, I'm sure will be the maestro here, but I'd be super curious, like whether regular Chinese are concerned about what's going on. But I guess we'll get to that.
Yeah, Pete, St Onge, before you do
absolutely.
your intro and we crack into that issue, because it's an interesting one that I have some questions on as well. Are you plugged into the right mic? Do you have the one in front of you selected? You sound a little echoey, so I just want to make sure. Yeah.
Maybe not. If I sound weird, then probably not. Let me.
You don't sound bad. I'm just making sure.
I think I do, but
okay.
Okay, I will do that whilst you guys converse for a second.
All right, you have a look. I'm just going to go with
John,
PA.
What's on top of your mind? What's
PA
on
and PO for this conversation? How about that?
Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a casual observer of China, but as I said in the beginning, one of the reasons why I'm interested in it is because I lived there from effectively 2009 to 2018. And, as a result, I was able to experience what it was like on the ground, and then come home, visit home, speak to friends abroad, and get an impression get a sense for what their impression of what was going on in China was, whether it's politically, economically, socially, or otherwise, and see such a massive gulf or disparity between my experience and what the perception was outside of China. And so this is why I think, and China's always been somewhat opaque for many reasons, both intentionally and unintentionally, as far as, how open they are about what's going on there. And so, I'm no longer being there. I don't have that perspective anymore, which is why I'm interested in kind of we're hearing now the economic data come out of China, and some of it is interesting. I hope we'll probably break into the real estate market bankruptcies and what's happening there. You guys mentioned the youth unemployment already. There's slight deflation, it seems like, happening there, a couple of months data on that. But PA, I'm just curious, like, what is the sense of people on the ground? We've come out of the COVID lockdown era. What is, because when I left China, even still, there was exuberance, energy, get after it, so much happening, so much investment going on. That was in 2018. What is the feeling on the ground these days?
All right. So probably, and I'll start, if you don't mind, by a disclaimer, if you will.
Sure.
I am no paid China shill. I absolutely agree, as I said earlier, with most of the critiques that are leveled against China. The biggest issue that I have is that the critiques themselves are, quite frankly, very reductive. It's youth employment, ergo. My favorite was, oh, they're all going to join the army and it's going to be a big war, or something along those lines. So there's this very much, A plus B equals C kind of, analysis going on. Now, having said that, what I can share with you is when we came out of COVID, and we can talk a bit about that. Like, John, when you and I last talked, I to this day am very adamant that the so-called protests that happened back in November, late November, my wife and I, we literally lived around the corner. I think I said to you, from Woolloomooloo.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there were a couple hundred people who were pissed off, but they were more angry at that point in time because Beijing had passed down to Shanghai the measures to lift the COVID policies. But for reasons we can go into, the Shanghai municipal government didn't follow through on it. So people's, rightfully year-long frustration over all of the various issues that were going on boiled over. And people were just like, let us out. We just want to go back to our lives. What I completely underestimated, because I had expected, much like actually the conventional wisdom, that there would be a second half sort of, resurgence, let's say, in the economics of China, and that has not played out. And my underestimation really came from the PTSD, genuine PTSD that people had felt coming out of the lockdowns. And at this point in time, it's still kind of there, but the overall sentiment right now is complicated. You have things like property prices clearly are off. We talk about, your whole podcast about Bitcoin. China, the store of value is real estate. So if real estate comes down even a little bit, people are going to be concerned about that. But overall, it's more of a sentiment issue from the 2022 lockdowns, 2022, every 3 days we had to go through, we had to take our phone, we had to get a test, all these sorts of things. That's just still working its way through.
Peter, just one comment on that before we throw it over to PO. I think I heard you mention, but during the lockdowns, I mean, this isn't really an economic point, but just a fascinating one that I thought, there was no vaccine mandates in Shanghai or China. Did I hear you say that?
Yeah, I actually, on the lovely app that we all use now, Nostr, um, I felt it was important to throw out and take it for whatever it's worth. There's no commentary involved in this,
Right.
but I was really surprised in 2021. China had come out with their own vaccine, and it was not an mRNA. It was just their own, whatever it was. And if you wanted to take it, you could, but you didn't have to. And I thought, and this was about summertime 2021, my expectation was, it's China. You know, by the time October, November rolls around, I'm going to get a text on my phone that says, be at this place at this time to get inoculated.
Mm-hmm.
You had none of that. Now, there's been some commentary that says in other places, and I have to be very upfront. While I have traveled around to a few other cities, I clearly have not covered the entire country over the last 3 years. And yes, I've been here the entire time. But at no point in time did China, and it wasn't even like the hard mandate. There was no soft mandate. They essentially said, look, the vaccine's available. If you'd like to take it, go on this app and schedule an appointment. And that was it. And, you know, if I can make it a little bit more personal, my wife, who is a yoga instructor, she's been doing it for a long time, all about health. She said to me, I don't want to do it. I said, don't. And there was it didn't impact her life, didn't impact her job, nothing. So again, I'm not trying to provide any commentary, but I thought it was super interesting given all of what I've heard coming out of the United States over that 3-year period.
Absolutely. All right, P.O., do you have any response to that, or?
Yeah, well, I'm fascinated about the vaccine. I didn't know that. It's consistent with the hypothesis that we mandated as kind of a power play, as theater to justify a power grab that maybe China didn't need. But that's fascinating. Okay, a little bit of background. I am an economist at Heritage Foundation, a former MBA professor in Taiwan, the other China. I don't know how far I can venture where this is broadcasting. I don't want to get.
You're good. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
And seriously, don't worry about it from my point of view either.
Okay. You got people. I've been writing about Bitcoin since 2014. I'm an Austrian school economist, so like most Austrians, I'm pretty open to it. Most of my academic work on China has actually been about the currency history. So looking at the Song dynasty, which is a fun one because that's the one that led to the Mongol conquest, which is sort of like if Sitting Bull not only defeated Custer, but took over the White House. it's just one of these ridiculous mismatches in power that, to me anyway, suggests that there was something very rotten going on in China at that time, much like the Roman Empire. But anyway, so that's where I'm coming from. And I do daily videos. I've done a couple on China recently just because I have been surprised how quickly things have gone south there. I figured that they would sort of muddle through. You know, a lot of the things that are causing the trouble now are generally things that they've been doing for about really ever since Xi came in. So I've been surprised at the change.
What is your impression? You know, we asked PA about kind of sentiment check. What is the data regarding inflation, deflation, debt, bankruptcies, car sales, all of these things that we use to assess the health of particularly the Chinese economy? What is your assessment of that data in terms of what is happening there now and what may be happening, you know, in the next 6 to 12 months?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Generally, manufacturing is declining. Housing is in a lot of trouble. The home builders are a huge part of the Chinese economy. That's partly because as they've sort of central planned a lot of investment into favorite industries, and one of those is housing. It can absorb a lot of money at relatively low disruption compared to other things. The problem is that something like 70% of Chinese household savings are in housing. And so that is a higher percent than it is in the West. And that means that any kind of distress in housing is a sort of existential threat for Chinese. So the housing industry writ large is about a quarter of the economy. Manufacturing is about another quarter. Manufacturing, of course, is also a much bigger percent than it is in the West, since we're chasing hours away. And so that's about half the economy that's in distress. You're then getting ripples like that youth unemployment rate. You know, the sort of broad problem with China in general is that not only do they lie about the statistics, everybody knows they lie about the statistics. There's like an entire shadow industry in China, like China Beige Book, who market economic proxies. The Fed, I think it was Atlanta, they put out a paper last year where they estimated that the Chinese economy is overreported by about 50%, going by nighttime light data. So like there are all these proxies like concrete imports, or, you know, looking at what Shanghai looks like at nighttime, that people have to use to estimate. And so that means that when data actually bleeds through, like when the government actually confesses that growth is slowing or that unemployment is high, then I imagine that Chinese investors and businesses tend to take this even more seriously, you know, because like if most of the time you can't see it, then when it's so bad it comes out, that is going to be surprising for them.
Well, that's a lot. Peter, PA, any comments before I go?
Yeah, I mean, look, and Peter St Onge, PO, whatever we're going to call you. I don't necessarily disagree with the comments, but I hope you'll give me some runway here. Number one, I have nobody. You know, when I say that I can talk freely and I can give you examples about it, it's China. I mean, there's no doubt China is an authoritarian regime. There's no doubt about it. But there are rules of engagement. And this is essentially what I tell my clients. I mean, my day job is one in which I help global, predominantly financial service organizations navigate how it is they can, you know, benefit, if you will, from the Chinese market. And while I sit here and talk with both of you, one of the primary struggles that I have is, you know, Peter, I've heard exactly what you've shared. I don't necessarily disagree with the comments that you've made, but I've heard them for 20 years. You know, whether it's Gordon Chang, you know, Kyle Bass, Jim Chanos. I mean, the list goes on where there is a cottage industry that has evolved over time that has really sought to attempt, and the operative word here being attempt, to sort of call this collapse of China. And of course, this time certainly could be different. But I find that there's always a danger in both underestimating and overestimating Chinese policymakers. And, you know, we can take it in a bunch of different directions. And again, I'm not denying issues in terms of manufacturing. The economy right now in China is weak. There's no denying that. My actual bigger concern is that China is actually the canary in the global economic coal mine. It's actually telegraphing issues that are, if you look at Germany and other, you know, geographies, these are, you know, issues that are going to metastasize elsewhere. But at the same time, you know, just being on the ground, it is, at least sentiment-wise, nowhere near as dire as what is being portrayed through the headlines. So, you know, I'm super excited to have you, you know, ask as specific questions as possible. You know, I'm more than happy to talk about Xi Jinping, because I think this whole concept that he is emperor for life and what he says goes and all of this is utter nonsense. But I just think that being here as long as I have, hearing all of these claims that China is going to collapse imminently, just hasn't happened. And to put a final pin on it, I think it's important that given the history of the arguments that have been made over the past 20 years, you sort of have to give a degree of credence, if you will, to the policymakers that whatever the problems are, they'll navigate them. Because from the Asian financial crisis to, the global financial crisis to whatever, China has yet to fall. And again, this time may be different, but up to this stage, policy has demonstrated that they've been able to navigate through all of these tricky wickets.
Yeah, I would agree on both those major points. People like Gordon Chang are constantly fantasizing about China collapsing, largely because they're trying to get the U.S. to start a war with them. There's this 40-year effort. We saw it during Japan as well. When Japan was coming up, I grew up back then, and you had all these people said, it's all smoke and mirrors. They're just playing with the numbers. They're just copying us. It's all going to fade, and the tide's going to go out, and we're going to see who's swimming without a suit. Well, guess what? Didn't happen. Okay, and the past 40 years. Up until Xi, I think it's very clearly China had much better policy than the U.S. We've been suicidal. We've been sacrificing our industry, our manufacturing on behalf of woke garbage. And I mean, we've been doing that my entire life. China, on the other hand, was very dynamic. It was extremely free market. So I don't buy the smoke and mirrors argument at all. Having said, I think Xi has been a lot worse for growth than some of the previous presidents. He's been harassing the private sector more. This cult of Jeremy Rifkin, if you're not familiar with him, he's this big global warming guy. He pushes, the third industrial revolution? And it was a previous premier, Li Keqiu, I think. But at any rate, this Rifkin garbage spread in like a virus in the Chinese leadership, and so that's been part of the problem here. Is all this money going towards green crap instead of what they used to do, which was hands off. It's better to beg forgiveness than permission. Entrepreneurs would basically do what they're going to do, and then if there were problems, they would come after the fact and kind of clean it up as partners. And I think they discarded that approach now. And what they're a lot closer to is state-led development, debt-fueled growth, hassling entrepreneurs. Ironically enough, in other words, China has become more like the West. So they've imported some of the anti-business sentiment that we've been doing for 40 years. And then at that point, the question becomes, I think Xi's probably around for a long time. The people I talk to anyway seem convinced that, he's got another 10 plus years on him as leader. And sort of at that point, the question is, can Xi change direction, or are his instincts does he like that state control, state pushing capital into the preferred and the politically favored industries, and not really having as much respect for the free market as Deng or Jiang or who even did. So it seems to me that, China's not dead. This is a rough patch. Yes. It might be comparable to the US in 2008. This is not the end of the Chinese miracle. Or put differently, whether or not it's the end of the Chinese miracle depends on how Xi reacts to this and what he does next. Does he reach for more control, or does he return to the pre-Xi China where the market was given a lot more respect?
John, do you mind if I jump in for one second?
No, just keep riffing whenever you feel like it.
Okay. Peter, I completely understand where you're coming from. I want to, because one of the bigger issues that I've had with sort of the commentary that's been coming out with China is with regard to the framing. And what do I mean by that? So there's been a constant deluge of commentary with regard to Xi came into power. He wanted to become one-man rule. Nobody could talk against what he wanted to do. He was going against 40 years of Deng Xiaoping reform, opening up, all of this stuff. And I'm here to tell you, full fact, he is breaking full clear of the, reform and opening up policies that were instituted in 1978. But what I find fascinating is there's been very little in terms of asking the question of why. Now, most of it has centered on, well, A, he wants to be premier leader. B, he wants to return to some market or Marxist ideology, so on and so forth. My point of view is that is incorrect. If you go back in time to about a little over 10 years ago, there was an issue that is commonly referred to now as the Bo Xilai issue, where you had this cadre in Sichuan that essentially wanted to run against Xi for power. And if you took a step back, and only in hindsight, I will be honest with you, I didn't see it at the time, but essentially what you found in looking back is the center was unable to hold at that point. You saw this fraction breaking out away from Beijing. It was in Tianjin, right near Beijing. You saw it down south in Guangdong. You saw it in Sichuan. The party was breaking apart. There were factions that were infighting. And essentially what I saw happen was she came in 2011 with Li Keqiang as premier. And what's interesting is that she and Li are from two very different, I would argue, diametrically opposed factions within the CCP. And I think this is an important point to make right now, is for everybody who believes that Xi Jinping is at the top of, this pinnacle of power and what he says goes is completely false. He may have consolidated more power than others prior to him, Zhang and Hu particularly, but there is still the party apparatus, and more importantly, a bureaucracy underneath it that needs to execute. And what I found has played out over time is the reason why Xi made the choice to be able to go in and be as aggressive as he was for the sole purpose of protecting the party, because the party itself was actually fracturing. There were too many people vying for various power points in different regions within the country. And that's why between essentially 2012 and 2017, his first term, it was all about anti-corruption. It wasn't particularly about going after his enemies. It was about going after genuine corruption. I mean, the corruption that may or may not exist today is nothing. And John, you know this, we talked about it last time, is nothing like it was 10, 15 years ago. I mean, back then, it was a free-for-all.
Yeah. The party literally stopped, basically when she started that campaign, because, and I mean, literally, because, you have all these lavish parties all over the place as a part of all that corruption and the money sloshing around, and he comes in and it stops and the invites stop coming. And, it was a definitive change in course in China at that time. And, one of the things that I find fascinating from the external commentators, as you were saying, people will say something like, well, it's a communist Marxist ideology and that can never win, so it's only a matter of time until they fail. Mm-hmm. I've always been struck by I think the primary orienting ideology, if you will, in China is not any particular political philosophy that we might identify. I think it's a pragmatism to the extreme, and probably a pragmatism in service of winning. And I don't think, there's some obvious parallels between Japan and China, but, those people that say, well, this is just, China or Japan 2.0, and they're, debt fueled growth. They buy up the world's resources, and then they have a lost decade or two because it was all smoke and mirrors, and, they're not going to ascend to the top global power. I don't think the same can be said for China. And there's many reasons for that. But one is, I think, they have not only a strong history of being, a top global power, but and PA, correct me if I'm wrong, but like there is the Chinese people writ large, I think they don't want to dominate the world in terms of like militarily. And now something maybe differently could be said for the CCP. I don't know enough to comment on that, but individually there is this pride and ascension and thinking like they want to be excellent. They want to be elite. They want to, be the best at everything. And I think that bleeds into a lot of policy decisions, so like you can have one party, two systems sort of thing going on when you're not married to an ideology, but you're married to an outcome, and the outcome is success writ large. And then we can debate the details of the type of dominance that they're actually looking for. And but one of the questions I had was, obviously the COVID era, it seems like the COVID era represents a major shift in many domains of life all around the world, in kind of, how politics is being done. People realize their dependency on certain supply chains. There's been a lot of, onshoring. The chip issue has become front and center, and people are trying to make sure that they have access to chips. And so you've got these initiatives in all these different countries to reshore a lot of that. I think politics is changing quickly, whether it's because there was a power grab during COVID and there's either been a pendulum swing the other way, and so there's a politics of combating that, or it was successful and so there's a consolidation of power. So I'm curious, we're talking about Xi Jinping and kind of what happened when he came on the scene, the corruption crackdown, his potentially different approach to economics and markets. PA, what's, what, and then the discussions that, let's say, he had with the tech CEOs, and the tension that, at least from an outside observer, seems to be happening there since COVID. And then his comments about Taiwan recently at the National Congress last year, I believe. What do you see, if any, the difference since COVID about the approach being taken in China, whether it's coming from Xi specifically or just the CCP generally?
Okay. And Peter, I'm super interested in your take on this, because there's, and again, you actually mentioned this in your video yesterday. I think I made a point to watch it. I truly enjoy your content, but there's a lot of talk about Jack Ma. Jack Ma got taken out behind the woodshed. Boom. And what I find fascinating is no one ever asked what happened. There's a urban legend about what may have happened. But the funny part is, because the work that we do is focused on financial services, we are intimately involved in, at the time, especially following Ant Financial and when they were doing the IPO, because they have, fund management and so on and so forth. And this also ties in, if you recall, around the same time that Didi issued in New York. And then, I don't know, was it 3 days later, the Chinese regulators, slapped Didi down and said, no, you've got to delist and come back to China. You didn't do things correctly. And there was a huge hullabaloo over this. But what I found fascinating was, with regard to Ant Financial, when we went over their prospectus, we actually internally in our company, we laughed, because we found out, for all of the fintech and all the stuff they were doing, it was essentially a bank. It was a bank that served small and medium-sized businesses, but it was a bank. And Ant had presented to the local SEC regulator here, the CSRC, a document that said, we want to make sure, because we have big data, that our reserve requirement's only 2%. And the Chinese law states that reserve requirements for banks are 30%. So Jack and his team were trying to do a bit of an end run to the regulators and said, we're going to do this. And the regulators said, no, we've done the due diligence. If you want to do the IPO, you've got to do a 30% reserve requirement. And then 2 days later, Jack Ma decided, for whatever reason, to go to what is commonly referred to here in Shanghai as the Bund Forum. It's one of the many, extravagant conferences that happens in Shanghai. And he went rogue. He went off on the regulators. They don't understand this. They don't understand that. And that very well may be true. I'm not denying that. But it was, the rules were X, Ant wanted to do Y, and the regulator said no. And I think the common theme between Ant and Didi that no one discusses is the primary investors in those two companies were not Chinese. They were foreign. They were VC and PE in predominantly New York. And at the time, both of those companies were looking to IPO. China was pushing through a data security law, which nobody likes. But this was before the data security law went through. And the VC and PE groups that had invested in these two companies essentially, metaphorically, put a gun to their head and said, you need to list now before this law comes through. And both of them tried to do exactly what their investors wanted to do, but it actually went against what the regulations were in China. So I'm not sitting here saying that the regulations that China has in place are the right ones or anything else, but they went against the rules. And it's those sorts of details that I find don't really get raised when you see these headlines that come out about corporate finance or structures or anything else about the China market.
Americans will only dream of 30% reserve requirements. We have zero at the moment. Banks can literally print any amount they can imagine. Yeah, and I think that goes back to, the earlier question of sort of characterizing this Wild West era pre-Xi, where, companies did have swing with regulators. They could criticize them in public. And then, you've kind of got a new reality here. And, which is, in a sense, that's China coming back to earth in the sense of coming back to where the US or Europe are, where regulators terrible ideas actually have to be obeyed. Whereas, I think a big part of the Chinese miracle was the fact that regulators did crap and companies just kind of did what they're going to do. And as long as there wasn't enormous collateral damage, and I think that's sort of the Confucian, what I'd characterize it anyway, the Confucian way to run an economy is how Japan does it. It's how Singapore does. Well, I don't know about Singapore, but anyway, certainly how Japan does it. Or Taiwan, where there's the rules on paper, but then there's a separate question, which is, are you bothering people? Okay, so in Japan, if you are smoking pot in your apartment, nobody cares. If somebody reports you to the police will be like, we have other things to do. On the other hand, if you're walking down the street singing in the middle of the night, then the cops will be there in like 2 minutes. All right, and it's this distinction between causing trouble and following the rules. And personally, I far prefer that Confucian version of it. And I think that's age old. One of the, we still have the exam questions from the imperial examinations from hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago. And they have economics questions in there. And one of my favorites to kind of illustrate the spirit is in the exam, and remember, this is the all-important exam. So if you pass this, then you get to be a bureaucrat, you get to run, province. If you don't pass this, you are nobody. Your mom is embarrassed. You have to go be a manual labor. And one of my favorite example questions was they asked, if you have a famine in your district, what do you as administrator do about it? And the correct answer is you subsidize transportation. So every wagon that comes in, you don't care what's in the wagon, you give them money. And that's so clever. It's just so practical, right? It's not asking who's right, who's wrong. Does the wagon guy deserve the money? No, that's not the question. The question is just quintessentially practical. How do you get more food into the district? Why? Because if the people are starving, they're going to start killing you. You, the official, are going to have, you're going to be hanging by your ankles. It's extremely practical. And I think in a way that China, whether, by plan or by accident, had kind of stumbled into what I think is the traditional, what made China for most of world history, if not the richest country in the world, then close to, which was that very hands-off approach. It's, I think, how Singapore got rich. I think China today is largely looking to Singapore as a model. Like when it grows up, it'll just kind of be this soft authoritarianism where it's there, but you don't really see it. And I mean, people do prefer that. Notably, there are almost no Singaporeans who sneak off the Philippines, but there are a lot of Filipinos who try to sneak into Singapore. Humans, when they can vote with their feet, they will take soft authoritarianism that makes them prosperous over the alternative. But Peter, I wanted to ask you a question, which is, I'm genuinely curious, how much of an influence do you think Tiananmen had, or sort of the kind of color revolution threat writ large, whether or not Hong Kong was part of that? It seems to me that a lot of countries are concerned that the US might be sponsoring these kinds of Arab Spring type things. And I wonder if that threat or that fear was part of what made Xi clamp down.
Clamp down in what regard?
To consolidate his power, eliminate rivals. My impression of the Hu Jintao thing last year was that was sort of warning his rivals not to screw with him. But it, sort of gave him more of an instinct towards control rather than the hands-off policy of his predecessors.
Okay, so the very quick answer, but then there's a follow-up to it, because I find that Hu Jintao issue, let's call it that, back last November, fascinating. And there's what I believe to be a very specific reason for it. But in terms of color revolution, post Tiananmen Square, all of that sort of, uprising against authority with regard to China, what I found is Xi Jinping doesn't care. What his real focus has been upon in the last 10 years is the party. There has been dramatic tension, dissension, and I would go so far as to say a soft civil war within the party between especially 2017 and 2022 to especially the 20th Party Congress. And it's the reason why, again, my opinion, why he stacked the state council. So let me provide a little bit more context to give you why he doesn't care. So when he came into power, as I mentioned before, my honest belief is he genuinely recognized that there was a threat to the party by a disintegration at the fringes. And he wanted to come in. And it started, if you go back and look at the records, it started with finance, because a lot of the corrupt officials were using so-called third parties to manage, again, manage their money. And they all got taken out. So what ultimately transpired was a 2012 to 2017 period where I believe Xi Jinping believed that, okay, we've ironed out the issues that we have. And he went into 2017 with the 19th Party Congress, believing, and he had said in that Congress, that we need to make a fundamental shift away from growth at all costs to quality growth. And he essentially, by having Li Keqiang stay on as premier, who is from the other faction, it was a somewhat kumbaya, let's all come together as a party and let's all do this. Now, I didn't know until last November that there was this undersurge of, call it the bureaucracy, the regulators, a whole host of people who actually were in power and responsible for executing what the state council told them to do. Everybody in power came up under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. And the approach that she wanted to take was essentially undermining their power, their prestige, their being, if you will. And from 2017 to 2022, it was essentially a slow roll of pushing back against everything that she wanted to do. And I'll give you a really quick on the ground in Shanghai example. So in 2022, we get locked down April 1st. And the party secretary in Shanghai at the time is Li Keqiang, who is now premier. So everybody kind of then that Li Keqiang was going to get elevated. He was Xi's guy, blah, blah, blah. And what happened within 10 days of the lockdown, Li Keqiang wanted to take a different approach. He wanted to be a bit more loose, so on and so And it wasn't working as planned, obviously. So a woman by the name of Sun Chunlan, who was a vice premier, came in, and she is from the Hu Jintao administration, and started basically, busting heads, saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And it was all for the purpose of embarrassing Li Chang so that he did not go up in the 20th Party Congress to be the premier. And that's normally the way it goes here. Like, you do these sorts of things, you embarrass someone, and, oh, I can't bring them up. Story goes, and you'll have to pardon my euphemism here, Xi Jinping said, fuck that. I'm still bringing them up. Because he knew that he was being undermined with what he wanted to do, in my opinion, of moving towards this growth at quality approach. Now, I need to be so crystal clear about this. I don't know any or much of the details, and I sure as hell don't know if it's going to work, because over the last year, it hasn't looked well. But she recognized, in my opinion, that he was being undermined by trying to work within the broader party, that he said, screw this, I'm bringing in everybody that's worked for me, and we're going to do this, and we're going to dictate this. So over the course of the last 12 months or so, since the 19th or 20th Party Congress, you've seen a lot of people taken out, not because she is trying to solidify his power. He's emperor for life, whatever he wants. It's to get people in positions to execute what the state council sends down. Apologies for the diatribe. I didn't mean it to go that long.
No.
No.
It almost sounds like Trump. Like, you've got this deep state, and you've got the leader on paper, and then the state does whatever it wants to do, and of course Trump can't remove people. So the growth at quality shtick. So I mean, I guess I would simplify that as just state-led development or industrial policy, and then of course the alternative would be what Hong Kong did, which was nothing. Hong Kong went from $3 plastic toys to like financial center with minimal direction from the state. But that sort of state-led development or growth at quality. So given what's going on now with the declines and the asset bubbles, do you think that those other factions are going to be strengthened, and that there'll be more opposition to that policy, but also maybe even to Xi?
That's the question of the day. Because, we were 8-9 months into the year. The trajectory clearly isn't positive. We don't really know the details of exactly what their intentions are in terms of, as I pointed out, is a new growth model. And what are you seeing coming out in terms of policy? Real estate. Okay, we're going to. And I find it super fascinating, and I would hope, Peter, that you would look into this, because number one, everybody has equity in property. It's not like 08, 09 in the United States where you throw the keys back to the bank. But that, you would think someone like me would say, oh, so that means that. No, there's a different problem that comes from that, which is, okay, as I said earlier, it's a store of value. So if my store of value is going down, then I'm going to, pull back on, what I spend. Literally not but 4 or 5 hours ago, one of my guys, the head of research in my company, he said that, China essentially just changed some of the tax incentives, where I think you're getting 2,000 instead of, they've doubled the tax incentive for children, double the tax incentive if you have parents over the age of 65. So they're starting to move in this direction. But I completely agree with you, Peter. We don't yet know what the whole new growth model is going to be. I've seen some of it with regard to, as much as we've seen this reshift towards state-owned enterprise, which you're absolutely right. That I think is more about power consolidation, to the point I was making earlier with regard to, these companies are essentially run by the party, however you want to define it. But fascinatingly, there is a growing demand for people to go out and do their own thing. So I think the pendulum is swinging back and forth. And right now, with what she's trying to achieve, he's just going, as the communists tend to do, in the other direction of, all right, we're going to focus on state-owned enterprises. We can control that and then move forward. But full disclosure, I have no idea right now.
Well, I guess that
no, sorry, John.
I was just gonna say, I guess that partially supports the notion. I mean, and PO as Austrian, and I think even PA, you'd probably agree with this. I mean, when you get to the point where you start twisting more of the widgets and stuff like that, it's a bad sign, right? Because it's more intervention in markets, and you're not leaving markets to their own devices. And it's probably, you know, there may be other benefits from that control, but economic growth may be subdued as a result of that, which is why you bring up the example of Hong Kong and perhaps early China, which is, it was a lot of gray area and people could basically do what they want. And that's why you get such robust growth. So, I mean, one of my questions would be, and I think you kind of addressed it with that pendulum swing, you know, maybe all of this in service of party unity and power consolidation is going to continue to have a at least suppressive effect on economic growth. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, and PO, if you wanted to address what PA said first, go for it. But one of the issues around China, Japan, the demographics issue has been brought up lately. And, you know, Peter Zion, I'm sure you're both familiar with him. I don't, he's a bit of a douche, but, and, you know, his comments on Bitcoin are just completely asinine. But he's brought up the demographics issue a bunch, especially in relation to China. And I'm wondering if that factors into this notion that 2020 era was kind of a pivot point, and you have not only reshoring, not only more protectionism, you know, but you also have a demographic shift, you know, further into its playing out. So I'm just curious if you guys think that that is something that is par for the course with any developing economy, not a big deal, or if it's particularly pronounced in a place like China because of their intervention in that policy realm throughout the years, and it's going to continue to exert a suppressive effect more than it otherwise would.
I'll just kind of jump in with general, and then I think Peter's going to have more on the ground information. By the way, I've offered to debate Peter Zeihan because he is an idiot on Bitcoin. So he has so far blown me off. So if any listeners have poll with Peter anywhere, anytime. Okay. And so, right, broadly speaking, I think demographics are bunk. They account for almost nothing. The analyses of Japan, for example, as being demographic decline. Well, okay, so is Singapore. I mean, Singaporeans have like 1.2 kids. There's, yes, they import nannies, but I think demographics tend to be sort of just so stories. They sell. This is why Zeihan goes with that kind of stuff. He also goes with, like the world's always going to collapse because 87% of fertilizer is produced in one town in Kansas.
Right.
And, then like the bridge is going to, I mean, it's goofiness. But at any rate, so yeah, I'm not a huge fan of demographics in general. I think it is much more important if you have economic freedom and property rights. China, notably, its demographics were not stellar between 1978 and Xi coming in. I mean, they were absolutely collapsing, partly because the government forced them to. So I don't think that's really an issue. Japan's growth, I think, has been more about government intervention. It is relatively hard to start a business in Japan. It's harder than it should be. A lot of the economy is sort of hogged up. Not just the money, but even the people are sort of hogged up by these zombie companies. So I think there are other reasons why the dynamism has come out of Japan. And, if we look at all of the economies in Asia, pretty much all of them now have terrible demographics. I think Thailand is even below replacement. It's like 1.6 or something. Malaysia is far below replacement. And a lot of these countries are growing very fast. Vietnam, I think, is still at the good old days growth rates in China, and they've got terrible demographics as well. Peter, do you have thoughts specific to China?
No, I mean, I'll just state the facts, which is I arrived here And I remember everybody said, oh, China's going to get old before they get rich. And they are now old before they got rich from a, GDP per capita. It's numbers. I don't think it's a debatable issue. We knew this 20 years ago. When you institute a one-child policy and you carry it until literally not but 5 years ago, you can't just print, as we like to say, you can't print people. But I think what's going to be fascinating is, and this is the one thing that I've really taken away in my time here, is God, you just can't underestimate the way that China can incentivize the way in which people are going to operate. And just on that, let me give you a quick example. So we're in this property problem right now. Okay, let me tell you how it started in 1997. And in 95, 97, there were actually two different types of property. You had what was called Neishaofang and Weishaofang, which was you were a foreigner, you could buy this, you were local, you could buy that. And the market was just in the dumps. And the mayor at the time, who, and I will be honest, I don't know the guy or anything else, but I view him as being the man who built Shanghai. It was a guy named Shu Guangdi, and he was just amazing. And he created this thing called Tui Shui, which literally means the returning of tax. And he instituted this policy of, for the next 5 years, from 1998 to 2003, depending on where your tax rate is, we're going to return a certain amount of tax back if you buy a property. Well, it was only in Shanghai. It succeeded immensely, and it was carried forth across the entire country. And that was essentially, that one policy in Shanghai was the spark that lit a 25-year growth that is clearly unsustainable. I mean, I will be open and honest and say, if you look at the property prices that you have here and you say, what am I renting this at versus what is this value at? And is it 1%? Maybe. That these are not values that are sustainable. But I think the important part for me is you have a organization, let's call it that, with the party that understands what the problems are. And I think this is the biggest differential between the United States and America. No, I'm sorry, the United States and China. China actually understands that they have issues. The government, the party, the policy, they all understand what the problems are. Now, there are other issues revolving around that, but they're actually attempting, and they have been through, let's say through 2017, to address things like deleveraging and elsewhere. The United States, like the three of us on this podcast, we know what the problems are. Do the leaders in the United States know? I think deep when they look in the mirror at the end of the night when they're brushing their teeth, maybe. But in reality, I don't think they do. And I think that fundamentally is the issue because, and pardon me, and I'll get off my soapbox in a second, but that's what infuriates me about America right now, is China is the focus and they're not focusing on it. They're focusing on the wrong thing. They spent 20 years with this bizarre war on terror as China mercantilists just went across the board and said, we're going to take over everything. I mean, for Christ's sake, they got Saudi Arabia and Iran to sit down together. This is the world we live in today.
Do you think that relationship, I mean, at least the candidates on the Republican side, I'm thinking of Trump, Vivek, DeSantis, the more articulate ones, let's say, they have been bringing up the China issue. Now, one, I mean, I take your point, but, everything is politicized in the U.S. for a variety of reasons. One, because the political domain is one that people actually have some semblance of agency in, at least they think they do, right? Whereas in China, that's not as much a top of mind concern for the average individual. So they're just concerned about things that they can control, like making money. And, maybe that allows them to focus on real issues rather than political phony baloney stuff. But this issue of China, right? Their growing economic power, technological power, spying, all the things, has become an increasingly big point in the, at least American economic or political dialogue, let's say. Do you think that should a Republican candidate enter the White House in 2025, do you think that's going to be an issue, that kind of antagonistic approach with China, maybe not militarily, but a less, laissez-faire attitude towards them, more sanctions, more restrictions on, investing in America, buying property in America, buying land in America, IP, intellectual property, all that kind of stuff. Is that going to happen, do you think? And is that going to be, any significant influence on the Chinese economy?
Okay, hold on. Mr. St Onge, I would love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, for better or for worse, I hang out with these guys because I work at a Beltway organization. We try to be
Oh, that's right.
We try to be independent of it. But and my impression is that there are basically three parties in the US when it comes to China. There's the Democrats, there's the establishment Republicans, and there's Trump. And those are three completely different points of view. Generalizing grotesquely, the Democrats just want to give China anything they want. They are not particularly disturbed by the mercantilist things that China does. And I mean, some of them are pretty outrageous, like China forces foreign companies to hand over technology. In some cases, it steals it literally by espionage. It's pretty out there. So Democrats are fine with that. The Trump people, well, here, I'll start with GOP because they're all so simple. They just want a war. I've been in many meetings where they sit around and try to think of all the ways to handicap China, to screw with them, to get them upset. One of my favorites was they wanted to stop China drilling for oil in the Arctic. And, I argued with them. I said, look, I want humans to have that oil. I don't want the oil to be locked away just because the United Nations thinks the Arctic is a giant national park. So I don't care who drills it. If you want Americans to drill it, great. If not, then I want Chinese to drill it so it gets into the market. But anyway, they said, no, we gotta contain China. So this to me is a recipe for war, because of course, if you're saying China, there's nothing you can do, we're just gonna we're just gonna do everything we can to wreck you, then what do you think China's gonna do in response? And that's what you'd expect them to do, since I think their constituent is military contractors. And then you've got the third party, and the third party is Trump. And Trump's point of view, it is the point of view, I think, for most grassroots Republicans, but it's a minority view among the GOP leadership. And the point of view there is that China does a lot of bad things. And so, and we have all these leverage points, access to capital markets, and so rather than using those leverage points to simply hurt China because we hate them and we want to degrade them, let's use those leverage points to make China stop misbehaving. So to stop, stealing technology and discriminating against foreign investors, predatorily entering other markets, and so on. So a lot. What the next administration does, I think the establishment GOP are gone. They're like leftovers. They're running on fumes. They have zero support, zero public support. And so what the U.S. does next, I think, depends whether the Dems win or Trump wins. I think it's impossible that any non-Trump Republican is actually going to win, given the fortified elections.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, I completely agree with you. And one of the things that I found fascinating was, if you go back to 2016 when Trump won, I mean, we all talk about how many people were surprised. One of the constituents that was surprised was the Chinese, because they expected Hillary to come in and it was going to be another 4 years of playing that game. And Trump came in and was like, no, we're going to play a different game. And they had a scramble. And the most important takeaway when Trump lost in 2020 was that the Chinese said to themselves, and again, I don't know that they said this, but we have 4 years. Trump identified all attack vectors on the Chinese economy. He blew them out in the press, capital markets, chips, you name it. We need to figure that out. And the question is whether or not they're going to be able to solidify those issues by the time if let's call it a non-Biden administration comes in. And quite frankly, they're working tirelessly to see if that can happen. Now, my bigger concern, and Peter, I think you and I are on the same page with this, and quite honestly, it's one of the reasons why I'm super excited to be able to talk to you, is I don't really care about China's economy. I don't care about what's going on. I'm more concerned about the drumbeat of war, because, like you said, you were in Taiwan, right? So here we have, you and I are around the same age. You were in Taiwan at some point. I've been in China. These are all Han Chinese. If you look at a map of East Asia, why did China decide to literally build islands in the South China Sea? Because the East China Sea was already surrounded. China was doing what, let's be honest, Mearsheimer would have said is reasonable from a power politic perspective. They built islands in the area that they're not in, from Korea to Japan to the Philippines, Australia, you name it. And Taiwan is that one center point. This has nothing to do about chips. This is about the Navy. And, you know, I had to laugh, I don't know, it was a month or two ago when there were these headlines about China had some mission in Cuba. And the US went apeshit that the Chinese were in Cuba. I'm like, you literally have China surrounded on the East China Sea. Like, if we did that, if anybody did that to the United States, you would have the same reaction. This is just reason. I don't agree with everything at all with China. I don't agree with everything with the United States. What I struggle with is this drumbeat of war, and this absolute moron who's 39 years old, who's from Wisconsin, running some select committee that's called the Select Committee Against the Chinese Communist Party, Michael Gallagher. Like, I looked at everybody he brings into these hearings. They're all the people that are bashing China. There needs to be a conversation, and that's not happening. All right. Apologies.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that China's ideal, where it wants to be across the factions, I think where it ultimately wants to be is Singapore. And it strikes me that the US can eminently live with a giant Singapore. So yeah, I constantly fight the warmongers, but you know, China is the most profitable war going. I mean, at the moment they're making a lot in Europe, but you know, China's waiting in the wings. That's their big venture capital investment. That's the big one that'll pay off for them.
Well, you know, this is just par for the course, you know, empires in history, right? There's been many commentators that have, you know, spoken about this. And when an emerging power is coming up, and maybe at first it's economic and then it becomes, you know, military, as they have the funds to build out a military, it's almost like the incumbent power can't help but saber rattle because, you know, ultimately they're scared. You know, I agree with you both. I've always found the hypocrisy to be appalling and hilarious. You know, you have, and again, I'm not a defender of any of the bad things that China may do, but you have the US with, you know, what is it, military bases in like 180 countries around the world, and certainly in South Korea and Japan and the Philippines. And, you know, again, as you said, all surrounding China, you know, China dips his toe like somewhere else in the world or runs afoul of them somehow. And it's all like, oh my God, how could, look at the aggression of this dictatorship. It's like, you know, it's the pot calling the kettle black, of course, you know, in the most egregious way. But, you know, that is how empires rise and fall and how power shifts. And I think we are, if not certainly approaching, you know, one of those shifts in history because simply of the economic might of China rising and their influence in the world. And you look at the maps of, you know, who's the primary trade partner of any given country. 10 years ago, it was probably the US for the bulk of countries in the world. And now I think China has the majority, you know, so this really is a seismic shift in the scale of world history. And most people won't believe it until after the fact when it happens, which is always the case, right? Are you going to call the fall of Rome in, you know, 300? No, but in 600, we're like, oh, of course, of course that was going to happen, barbarians at the gates and whatnot. And, so one of the things that I don't think anyone can comment on this with any degree of accuracy, but it's obviously the case that China influences beneath the surface politicians in the US, Congress people, senators, that kind of stuff. I mean, even these Hunter Biden laptop revelations seem to, I don't know all the details, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the case that China through Hunter to Joe was, trying to exert some influence, by paying them off in some capacity. And that's, again, I mean, I think all countries probably do that, but China, with the amount of influence and wealth that it has to share around, is probably doing that in a lot of countries, and the US would be, included in that. So there's a saber rattling issue over Taiwan. I guess question for both of you. And that when I was living in Japan in 2003, that was on the newspaper often, like, Japan or Taiwan installs certain missiles and China's upset about it. And so this issue has obviously been bubbling for a long time. But she mentioned in the Party Congress last year, right, or reiterated that Taiwan is part of China. They're the same people. They're the same concern. And, you're always looking at the rhetoric to see what the posturing is. But given the ever shifting imbalance of power, and I want to get to kind of the debt, money printing, economic situation between the US and China in a moment, but just their growing influence, their influence over policymakers in the US, and their stance that Taiwan is a part of China, and the US's implicit or explicit support for Taiwan. Is this something that either of you think is actually could bubble up into a very real hot war in the not too distant future?
Yeah. So
you want me, Peter, or you go? Yeah, you go.
Yeah, I'll just jump in for a sec. So policy is always an auction between special interests, right? And China is throwing a lot of money around Washington, but of course, there's a lot of other people who throw money around Washington, right? So they could be outbid by military contractors or by finance, or probably Green at this point actually throws around enough money to get a seat at the table. So I don't think necessarily that the U.S. is going to be a slave of China. China is just one more massive lobbyist. I think in general, conflict is not inevitable. It's true that historically, when you have a rising power, they frequently go to war with the status quo power. But, if we look at Britain versus Germany, for example, regular British people, like the fact that Germany was getting rich, this wasn't bothering people in the pub. Like people weren't sitting around in the pub like, we really got to go to war with them. Look at their GDP, adjust it for the purchasing power. Okay, it was the elite. And it's always the elite in the status quo that is concerned about the upstarts, because the elite has certain privileges. The US, the people who push the US into war make an awful lot of money on those wars. And they do not want anybody else muscling in that game. So I don't think it's inevitable just because China is rising, we must go to war. I think it's a very specific question of there are specific individuals who have specific incentives. And if those line up towards war, then war will happen.
And how much, just before what's the likelihood that you think those incentives are pointing in that direction?
So I think, the incentives in the U.S. are currently, I think it varies by party. So, one party, the establishment thinks it'll make, is being influenced by donors who are interested in more conflict. The other is not. But I think that, when we sort of price out the probabilities of blood being spilled in Taiwan, at least I think that the biggest factor there is going to be Xi himself. So if he feels secure, then, if you're winning the race, then you don't do anything weird. You don't change anything up. You just keep doing what you're doing. So I think the only risk factor there is if one of those other factions, if it looks like they're going to knock Xi out, then maybe he needs something exciting to happen. But I think fundamentally the cost benefit for Xi is horrific going into Taiwan. The geography is not friendly at all. It's an amphibious invasion. The last time the Chinese military really had a full-out war, they got their butts handed to them by Vietnam. they hold the line with India, which is not very impressive. So I don't think Xi is looking for an adventure. I think he talks about Taiwan to rally the troops, but fundamentally he doesn't do anything unless he's endangered. But Peter, you may have better information on that.
No. I in a certain way, I completely agree. In other ways, I disagree. But I loved your comment before about the Song Dynasty. I tell people all the time, the Chinese have never won a major conflict. The Mongolians beat them, the Manchurians beat them. But what I find fascinating is China operates from the standpoint of you may win the war, but if you don't win the peace, you didn't win. And I don't mean to be crass, because quite frankly, and I'm going out here when I say this, but I think it's relevant with regard to Taiwan. If you look at Xinjiang and you look at Hong Kong, until you, what's the proper term for it? I can't remember, but you need to basically assimilate the other party into your domain. So when the Mongolians and the Manchus took over, what did the Chinese do? They intermarried. And again, apologies, they fucked the invaders out of the DNA. This is what happened with Hong Kong, because everybody that's talked to me about Taiwan, they said to me this, well, look what happened in Hong Kong in 2019. I said, okay, let's look at what happened in Hong Kong in 2019. Hong Kong turned over in 2007, right? So we're talking 20 plus years. And the Hong Kong I went to for the first time in 2004, and the Hong Kong I went to last time in 2019, went from being a British colony with Cantonese speakers to being just another Chinese city, because they assimilated the entire city to becoming Chinese. That is not Taiwan. And this is where I will disagree with the respect, Peter. She knows he can't win Taiwan, not because he can't throw bodies at it, he can, but because it's not assimilated. He can't, the 5,000 years of history has been, and they've done this in Xinjiang, or I should say they're doing it in Xinjiang. They're doing it in Xizang in Tibet. That's just the status quo. That's how they do things. So every time I hear people talk about there's an impending war in Taiwan, there's only one reason why a war would take place. And that is if America, quote unquote, accidentally started it. The Chinese, in my opinion, do not want it because they know they can't win the peace.
Interesting. And then there's a peripheral concern. I don't know if you guys heard, Tucker was on Adam Carolla yesterday or the day before. And he's Tucker's always good for, both a laugh and touching on the sensitive subjects. I think one of them was bringing up again Barack Obama's homosexual drug-fueled escapades. But that's beyond the point I'm making now. The point he was making was that, obviously there's a lot of concerns around you.
No, I want to talk about that. Wait a minute.
Well, I think he's actually going to interview the guy who made the claim, so I'm sure that'll be extremely fascinating. But relatedly, I think there's been speculation he's going to interview Putin, which would just, I think break the internet. That would be so fascinating for Tucker to interview Putin. But this was the point he was bringing up, and there's a lot of concerns around the Ukraine-Russia war and, what that could potentially bubble into. And Tucker was making the case that he thinks, the incentives and the U.S. geopolitical apparatus, they want a, hot war between NATO and Russia. And maybe that is in place of a hot war in China. Maybe there's too many, shared investments. There's, the incentives are too aligned between the U.S. and China, or at least the U.S. elites and the Chinese financial interests, that wouldn't, that's not serving enough people. But something along the lines with Russia, where those same financial interests and ties are not there, but there's a hell of a lot of money to be made from, the military industrial complex and otherwise. Perhaps those incentives are conducive, and maybe that's what happens. And that would be equally disastrous, I think, for the world. Nobody wants to see that either. but perhaps that's where the military geopolitical winds are blowing now, and China will be once again just, there'll be some rhetoric back and forth, but they'll be left to, do what they've been doing for the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, they might be pacing themselves, because they can only digest one war at a time. You want to, they can only make so many bombs.
Right.
And so they want to have one war at a time. I also note that, the sort of the game of lobbyists between those who want conflict and don't want conflict, that is being affected now with this decoupling discussion, right? Where in the US and Europe as well, protectionists are trying to replace Chinese imports with domestic production. One of the unintended consequences of that is that it means that a lot more big American businesses, if they exit China, then they exit that sort of bidding auction for over China policy. And, I think that's, in a way, that's what happened in Russia. The major US businesses that are doing that are making money in Russia, they didn't have the kind of lobbying pull that the military industrial complex does. I think up until now, the major companies doing business in China did have that kind of pull in the US as well as in Europe. And I don't think that's changed substantially yet. But if it does, then at that point, at least the Democrat Party, I think, would flip over. And then at that point, I think the odds raise substantially of a conflict, perhaps waiting until Europe is done making money, and then they can move on to the next one.
Well, Peter, PA, do you have anything to add to that before I move on a little bit?
Look, I've got nothing to add other than my reason for existing at this point in time is to do whatever I can to stop America from going to war with China.
Right. Well, one of the, another common thing throughout history is whenever there's domestic strife, typically economic, which turns into social, cultural turmoil, then a scapegoat is sought. And a scapegoat is usually not the people in power who are responsible for the situation, but somebody else, right? It's somebody else's fault for the inflation or for the plague or for the, name it. It's always external. And I'm curious what you guys think. I mean, there's the sentiment on kind of where the global economy is heading over the next 12 to 18 months is a little bit split. I think there's probably more people in a contraction is coming, probably going to be fairly rough, but it is split. And there's some people that think we're through the worst of it. Inflation is coming down and, things will lag for a while until there's sufficient reason to cut rates, and off to the races we go again. But my question is that, I tend to be in the former camp. I think there's a lot of variables that seem to suggest that at least the system is continuing to disintegrate. If there's no failure, terminal point moment, and the problems will continue to fester and get worse, the economic, social, et cetera, and they'll become sufficient that all countries are going to be looking for a scapegoat. And that's usually when you have such aligned incentives that you get some larger scapegoat. And oftentimes, that bubbles up into conflict. And so I'm curious, one, how you see the global economic picture forming, in the next 12 or 24 months, and how destabilizing that will be, and how that, how you put that into your calculus for global conflict. Because, it's, on the one hand, you wake up in the morning and you step outside and you go about your daily routine, and things seem like they're going to continue. There's a recency or normalcy bias, right? I think they're just always going to be the same. But what the COVID era kind of showed us is things can change dramatically, really quickly. The COVID virus has landed in Canada or the US. What's going to happen? Oh, 10 people have it. Oh, 12 people have it. Oh, shut down for 2 weeks. 2 years later, we know what happened. And so things can change really quickly. And those can be very dramatic and negative changes. So I'm curious what both of you think about that particular issue, that the economic, one, what is your economic sort of projection? And two, will it be, if it's negative, how much that will influence the already kind of festering conflicts around the world?
Peter, you go first.
So I do think an economic slowdown is guaranteed. If you hike rates to the degree they have, that we have centuries of economic history that confirms that is in fact the only way that you get a recession, unless you a volcano erupts. Unless you have some just ridiculous natural disaster or war. That's really the only way that you can make one. So I think we're absolutely guaranteed to slow down. It is possible that it won't even get to 0%. In other words, we might just have 0.1. I don't know. And the reason is because COVID was such a massive disruption, like never before, maybe not since the plague of Antonine had they ever shut down half of the frickin' economy for a matter of years. So I honestly don't know. I would not be shocked if we limp at 0.3% for 4 quarters instead. But I think the moral of the story is that there's going to be a lot of job losses. There's going to be a lot of lost wealth that is going to raise conflict. And countries do historically look for scapegoats. They look for it. It becomes temporarily profitable to start wars or to start friction with foreigners because you are looking for somebody else to blame. I think there's an additional problem, which is that the COVID disaster was
Your audio cut out, Peter.
The other Peter.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, St Onge. It's still out.
All right. So let me jump in before he comes back.
Yeah.
Because I've got a more what I'll call realistic perspective, which is, look, I think the three of us are all on the same page, which is we can see the writing on the wall. We can see where rates have gone, all of this. And it's unprecedented. There's a slowdown. You know, one of the things that I always found funny, I'm not sure if Peter's listening, but, you know, for all of the pomp and circumstance around China's not releasing anymore their youth unemployment. I was like, yeah, nobody believes American BLS numbers anymore. It's like, it's that kind of concept that we're at.
Mm-hmm.
But the bigger issue that we have right now, or what I see, is we're heading into a presidential election. And we'll call it, in air quotes, the establishment. They want a Biden or whomever will be Biden to be in there. And the best way to be able to get someone to be supported is to have a war president. So my concern in 2024 is not that China's going to start a war with Taiwan. Honestly, I don't think that's in the cards. But I think that there is going to be some form of accident that leads to war that gets people to rally behind the US president in a time of war. And I certainly don't wish that, and I don't want that to happen. But that right now is, again, I keep going back to, everything I'm trying to do right now is trying to prevent that, even if in a small way.
Mm-hmm. That was actually one of the things that Tucker brought up again in that interview I was referring to, because, you know, there's been some, you know, a new variant has emerged recently and a few people got sick, right. And there's been some mask mandates coming through. And the guy asked Tucker if, like, are they going to ramp this up again so that they have the same circumstance for the 2020 election? And again, like, I don't know what happened in the 2020 election. Obviously, I'm sure every election there's some questionable stuff going on. Maybe there was more on that one. I haven't seen the details. I mean, I think there's tons of fuckery all around, but he was saying, like, will this be invoked to, you know, create the same circumstances, whether it's mail-in ballots or what have you, in order to, you know, sweeten the deal for whoever the Democrats ultimately end up running. And Tucker said, no, I don't think it's going to be that. I don't think people are going to buy that anymore. You know, you know, it was a mask off moment, pun intended, in COVID era. And a lot of people, you know, kind of took the red pill, and not enough are going to buy it for that same playbook to be played, or for that same play to be played from the playbook. And he, you know, Tucker said, I think it's going to be, you know, NATO v. Russia war. You know, that would be sufficient to muddy the waters and to implement whatever you need to implement to allow whatever your operations or influence are to sweeten the deal for your own side, to give you the sufficient cover to actually do so. And maybe even the, you know, the public mandate, although that's questionable. So, yeah, I mean,
can you hear me now?
Concerning. Yeah, you're back.
Okay, good. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. They're like running through the 4 horsemen, you know, and they've already done the one, and so they have to put a respectable distance before they pull the next one. Yeah, and the point I was going to make earlier when the sound went off was similar to Peter's, that, you know, normally you assume that the elite does not want disaster. they don't want catastrophe, right? You sort of assume that we're on the same page, that they would prefer that society not collapse and that we not be destroyed. And I think that a real problem with what happened with COVID is that it worked out so great for them. The people who put the restrictions on made out like absolute bandits. They got power, they got tons of money. It was really a lot of fun. And so my concern is that they may have walked away with the lesson that, say, a hot war with NATO would be similarly useful. And so, they sort of abandon their traditional benevolence, and they might actually trying to pick a fight. Because, normally when you have a recession, it doesn't necessarily lead to war. Like the last 10 recessions since 1930, we did not actually start world wars. You'd have to get creative with, Desert Storm with the, no, not really. So I think normally they don't necessarily lead to war. It raises the odds, yes. But my bigger concern right now is whether COVID kind of created a set of incentives where they might be very excited about looking for the next catastrophe.
Yeah, that's an excellent
Peter,
point.
hold on. I got to ask Peter a question. Did you see all of the push that came out to get NATO to set up a so-called mission in Tokyo?
No, I haven't seen that.
Oh my God. When they met, what was it, in Toulouse or wherever it was, when they had to they were pushed, and it was Macron who was like, we're not doing this. And I laughed my literal ass off because I was sitting there going, wait, you're the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What are you doing? I mean, it's bad enough you're in Baghdad. I don't get why you're trying. And so when I see everybody up in arms about the Chinese, and again, the Chinese shoot themselves in the foot every other day. Absolutely. But the fact is, if you look at a map of the East China Sea and you're like, oh, we're setting up NATO in Tokyo with a mission to protect democracy. I'm like, no, you're not. I'm like, this is nonsense. Like, you're perpetuating the same thing that literally you did to Russia and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're pushing an agenda for what you want to achieve, and and nobody picked up on this. It drove me insane.
Yeah. It's like venture capital. They put a little bit on every war. They got 180 ventures, and the key in venture capital is that most of them don't work out. But then you have, every so often you got a couple of home runs, and those pay for the rest. And it's a venture business. NATO is over in Japan. They're trying to expand, trying to increase their total addressable market so they can ramp up the revenue. I mean, it's so cynical.
I know. That's dark, man. That's dark. But you know what? I mean, again, one of the silver linings of the COVID era was that the trust in institutions, media, government, corporate, has been dialed down dramatically. And so when people see things like this, whether it's even with Ukraine, right? The media wants you to think Putin, devil, Zelensky, Jesus, and this is a battle between good and evil, and that's all you need to know about it. And almost everyone is like, come on, like, we know there's more to it than that. We know you're lying. We know you're full of shit. And I think a lot of people, many people were red-pilled before that, but a lot of people were red-pilled during COVID. And so a lot of people are seeing the world very differently. And I think that is a silver lining. But to P.O.'s point, simultaneous to that was the corporate interests and the government interests and the media interests and the big tech interests going, holy shit, look what we just did over the last 2-3 years. Look at how much fucking money we made. Look what we got people to do. And look how little like blowback or punishment or negative consequences we received from it. Yes, the gravy train stopped, but ain't nobody put in jail. Ain't like nothing really bad has happened. And we made off like bandits for 2 years and made 20 years of income and revenue in 2. How much of an incentive does that create for the next time there's even a semblance of a reason to do something similar for all those interests to converge again? Again, you don't have to be in the realm of conspiracy theory for this. This is a conspiracy of interests. And that's always how these things, and incentives, how these things work. And that's, again, another cause for concern that those interests were rewarded so much and punished so little for what happened. Why would they not support something similar to happen again, whether the cause be an invisible virus or an invisible evil or an invisible terror or a war or something like that. So,
And-
you know,
And,
go ahead.
and those people are now going to be infected for life. They've gotten a taste, they held the ring in their hand.
Right.
If you look at the history of World War I and II, so during World War I, we had an essentially totalitarian economy. And the guys who ran, like, if you wanted to, there was a specific case, the company wanted to come out with a new brand of shovel. And they had to apply to whatever the Ministry of Production to see whether, like, are there already too many shovels in the market? And so would this be wasteful competition? Is this a good use of resources? I mean, that was literally the economy we lived in. So from a production perspective, we were the Soviet Union during World War I. And the guys who ran that was the Hoover and his gang. He was the Secretary of Commerce, so he was the ringleader. Herbert Hoover loved that. All those guys spent the rest of their life trying to replicate it. When FDR came in, FDR was just lightweight. You could just, whatever head was last on the pillow was going to be his opinion. And they saw a guy they could control. And so they pulled him over and they reimposed their industrial dictatorship. So the moral of the story is that once these guys get a taste of power, I mean, they have to be banned from politics. They have to be like, put on like a farm out in Montana and kept away from polite society.
Well, this brings me to the culmination, I guess, of this discussion, and I'll hand it over to you both for closing remarks in a second. But I mean, this is why I don't think. I mean, the power centers are so entrenched, and the capital and the influence is so entrenched. My opinion is not that you should give up on political solutions, because if you can gain an advantage somewhere, why not gain it, right? Your life could be made worse, and if there's any way of having it not be made worse by engaging in that apparatus, then do so. But long term, I don't see a solution to these problems arising when the money printer effectively still has as much power as it does, because ultimately I think we could trace a lot of these distorted incentives and the institutions that emerge from them to the capacity to effectively create money and determine where it's allocated. And that's the world we have today. And so I think this is my pitch for Bitcoin is I think given the course of time, that's what Bitcoin is going to supplant. And I think it will rectify a lot of those incentives that are effectively anti-human or anti-human flourishing. These incentives that collude for destructive purposes for the benefit of a very small few at the expense of the many. I think that's what Bitcoin can fix. However, the timeline is always the big question mark. How quickly can Bitcoin exert its influence, and will it be quick enough to avoid some of these things that we've been discussing? So I'd love to get both of your takes on kind of what we've been discussing through the Bitcoin lens and its capacity to effectuate positive change or influence around it all. PA, why don't you go first?
Look, I literally have been away from America for so long that I can just talk about it from the standpoint of China. And I think, Peter, you'll appreciate this. China right now, I had to laugh. I don't know if it was the Journal or Bloomberg or whomever, literally had a quote that said, if China just gave stimulus to the people, everything would be better. And I remember reading that in the morning, and like coffee came out of it. I was like, you don't get China. China pulled out the money cannon in 08, 09. And unironically, the money went into the property market, and you could argue is one of many factors that has brought us to today. This may be naive, but I do believe this. The Chinese policymakers know Keynesian economics is dead, and they're trying to figure out ways to either A, not use it, or B, if they have to, do it in a way that is as limited and hopefully tactically applied as possible. Just because they're looking around at Europe, they're looking at the US, and they like anybody who thinks that what the G7 has done in the last 15 years has worked. Look, China has the benefit of understanding and watching, and they're brilliant at this, measuring what works and what doesn't work. And Keynes doesn't work. But they also, and I think we can all agree, we're all in an environment where debt begets debt begets debt. So what is it? I forget who says it, John. You can't taper a Ponzi, right?
Right.
Is that Foss? Is that I forget who said it.
Yeah, me too. But
that's the problem. That's the problem.
well, let me jut in for just 1 second before you guys do get on to closing remarks, because I wanted to bring this up later, and we can put it in tandem with the Bitcoin question. But as you just brought up, the Keynesian approach to managing economies, there's two kind of issues that have come up recently, which I just wanted to make sure I got both of your comments on before we shut it down. But one is the hullabaloo around the BRICS, expanding, and the posturing about using a different currency. And I have normie friends even sending me like links and articles about this stuff, like, oh my God, is this the end of the US dollar, and what's going to happen, and all that kind of stuff. So that, and as you mentioned, debt begets debt. The debt in China and the monetary expansion has been a topic of discussion, because when you're comparing, many bad circumstances, because of course that same criticism is levied at the United States and every other country out there. But you look at, debt to GDP and monetary expansion, and I think particularly the latter, it's particularly bad in China. And I'm just curious what implications you believe that has, if any, or if it's something that, is not distinguishable enough from everyone else to really make a difference.
Yeah, so I think BRICS, the only way that I think BRICS is really going to threaten the dollar is if they come up with some kind of gold-backed trade rail, and that would not be a national currency. No country in the world today wants a strong national currency because they all want to subsidize exports. Back when Europe was falling apart about 12 years ago, there was all this capital flight into Switzerland, and the Swiss franc like almost doubled in value, and Switzerland just panicked and printed as many Swiss francs as they could come up with zeros. And that's Switzerland, which is relatively grown up in the world of economic management. So no country wants a strong currency. If BRICS does something, then it'll be this kind of rail that could be used for trade. The main reason that they would do that is specifically to devalue the dollar, to knock out the reserve currency status. If China is promoting that, then I think it does stand a chance of taking on a lot of trade. It would obviously be a superior version of the dollar because it would hold its value better. You're free to trade in gold today, but of course nobody does because the transaction costs are so high. So if China were to subsidize some kind of rail like that to the point where the transaction costs are sufficiently low, then that could threaten the dollar. China and Russia keep hinting at that and flirting about it. The Russian embassy in Kenya is always their mouthpiece for extraordinary claims. Nothing's happened to date. So far, BRICS is still bickering over their crappy currencies. So India and Russia, for example, neither of them want to accept each other's currencies because they're garbage. They've historically been garbage. Who knows if Modi changes things? I should give a shout out because I know that a lot of people love Modi. To your broader point, John, on politics, I think absolutely you still have to keep writing politics as long as it's possible. And, first point is the worse things get, the more likely a political solution works because, people red pill or they wake up, they snap out of it. And that's true even if they cheat, by the way, because remember, the thing with cheating is the reason you cheat is so that you can ignore the other side's voters, right? But what happens is you can also ignore your own voters. All right, in both political parties, it's true in every country in the world, political parties are a permanent war between their voters and their special interests. And so what happens once you start cheating, initially it's great. You win every election. Wow, you're batting 1,000. Next thing that happens is you go crazy because you no longer pay attention to even your own voters. So you do things like defund the police in inner cities or get creative about the number of genders in the world. You do a lot of really weird stuff. And so the hallmark of a party that started cheating is things like 30%, 20%, 10% approval. at some point, even the cheaters don't play along because they're not certain that all the other vote counters are going to play along as well. Okay, so there have been hundreds of countries, Africa, Latin America, where they would shoot the opposition, they would shoot you for supporting them, they would throw you in jail, and guess what? It don't work because the ruling party goes nuts. So the implication is, I think the solution to this is political. Yes, sure, they cheat and they'll continue, but it doesn't matter. What it does mean is that things are likely to get a lot worse until people wake up. The ruling parties are likely to get even crazier than they are in the US and Europe. But I think for sure politics has a future. That is how we're going to get out of this. Final point on the money printers. So absolutely, the biggest issue on the money printers, I think, is that it becomes a permanent bailout fund for social engineers, right? So with the COVID lockdowns, for example, if you didn't have a Federal Reserve, then some junior bureaucrat would have showed up at their first meeting after COVID and he would have said, I got an idea, let's shut down half the economy. Yes, we'll be losing half of tax revenue. We can lay off government workers. It's no problem. Okay, they would have been out of there, fired. That's it, right? You are not right for the government. Instead, they knew that they had the Fed to print it all up. And every country in the world knew this, right? So worst case scenario, if the stuff hits the fan, the Fed will print our way out of it. That's why they can play games with the financial system. The US sits down and talks to central bankers in every country in the world and says, hey, look, if things get bad enough, don't worry about it. Call us up. We got endless amounts for you. So effectively, they can take these risks, right? They can go with these ventures to try to, change something, see what happens, break something, see what happens, because they always know that they can print their way out of it. So without a central bank, I think you return back to that 19th century model where governments were a lot more careful about things. You didn't start wars so willy-nilly. You actually paid attention to what things cost, to what the actual economic impacts were of your policy. Right today, we've sort of broken the symbiosis between government and economy, where in a sense, the government, it doesn't mind like banning fossil fuels or doing net zero or crushing the entire economy, because remember, we'll just print our way out of it. Now, of course, we know that you can't do that forever, right? But they don't necessarily know it because they look back and they say, my whole life, we've printed our way out of every disaster. We'll do it again.
Or care, because it won't be their ass on the line by the time the bill comes due.
Exactly.
And so can I get I know you're a Bitcoiner. So on what kind of a timeline do you see Bitcoin being it's a solution to any individual right now, right? To a certain extent and for certain elements of this issue, but when do you think it reaches a scale that it helps to rectify that particular issue?
Yeah, so that's the question. I think right now Bitcoin is primarily a lifeboat. And, as more people understand what's happening, more people do get on the lifeboat. And I think, throughout history, whenever fiat collapses, it's tended to go to gold, sometimes silver, but basically gold. And so I think we know how the story ends. We know that fiat always dies, and it dies in the way that it's dying right now. But, we don't know the end of every chapter. We don't know exactly when that comes. Depending when it does come, so if the end is like in the next 15 years, then I'm pretty sure we go to gold initially, just because not enough people are familiar with Bitcoin. Generally, it's younger people who know Bitcoin, the kind of people who, the sort of mavericks and central banks who would opt for hard backing. Very few of them are Bitcoiners. So I think if it happens in the next 15 years, then we probably go to gold. And then we continue doing what we are, which is that Bitcoin gradually takes market share, mind share. Unfortunately, I think it was Max Planck that science advances funeral by funeral. Mm-hmm. And it is very rare for older people to grasp Bitcoin. So in that scenario, with the collapse happening soon, we go to gold. Gradually, people understand Bitcoin. At some point, some country will experiment going to Bitcoin because I think it's inherently superior, the cost, the use, the censorship. On the other hand, if the end is not coming for 30 or 40 years, then by that point, I think that there will be a lot more Bitcoiners than there are gold bugs, even in positions of power, and then we're likely to go directly to Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, before I hand it to PO, any final comments beyond those questions that I asked of you? Because this was probably where we'll finally shut it down here.
No, this has been a lot of fun, though. I appreciate it. So it's been great perspectives, and you did great, John.
Thank you. Thank you. PA, over to you.
I've got nothing to add. I mean, what Peter just laid out, I think makes a ton of sense. I just continuously concern myself with the issue of whether the United States wants to go to war with China. Because I know China doesn't. Yeah.
Can I just ask you that issue about the debt and the money printing in China, is it
Oh, yeah.
not sufficiently, divergent or different from any other country to make a difference?
Right now, it's for me, we'll call it divergent. Look, it's left pocket, right pocket. Is it, central government fiscal, or is it local government fiscal? And that's what they're playing with right now. The benefit I think that China has is that they have, in certain elements, a piggy bank, or they've got productivity, or whatever the case might be, which the US doesn't have. Now, how long is that going to last? It's not going to last long. So I genuinely believe that the Chinese policymakers know this, and they're scrambling right now to try to figure out how to get from point A to point B. If you were talking about BRICS before, look, China, Russia, India, none of them want. Look, what happened to Gaddafi, right? Like the whole urban legend was Muammar Gaddafi wanted to start, pricing oil in euros, and he got taken out. So there's a knowledge of, like, we're gonna, pardon my expression, fuck with the US dollar, but we're not gonna poke America in the eye. And that's kind of what I see going on. And it's the frog in boiling water analogy. But at the same time, domestically, yeah, China's definitely got a debt problem. Every country has a debt problem. Italy, China, America, Canada, it doesn't matter. Keynes, my favorite idea that I came up with in the last couple of weeks was, Keynes is famous of saying, in the long run, we're all dead. Well, you know what? Keynes is dead. It's over. And I think that's what people need to look at when they look at Keynesian economics, because all of us who have kind of grown up, whether it was Bitcoin or Ayn Rand or whatever the case might be, we had to learn Austrian economics. No one taught it to us. We had to stumble upon it. Well, I can't speak for you, Peter, but I didn't. I stumbled upon it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the Hayek quote is always my favorite, because, the allure of the money printer and the power that it conveys is just, no one can resist that. It's like the ring of power that was alluded to earlier, right? You just, if it's under your control, you're going to use it, and you're going to do Keynesian stuff with it, because that's its nature. And that will never be interrupted or stopped unless something comes along that can do so in a sly roundabout way that cannot be stopped. And I think we finally have that, because it certainly wasn't, tethering currencies to a basket of commodities or gold or any of that in the past, because of course that can be easily circumvented and corrupted and done away with. But I think in Bitcoin, we actually have that now. The 21 million Bitcoin question is just, at what pace does that happen? And it's my particular position that, I agree, some people just won't adopt new technologies. They're going to have to die off effectively. But I do think one of the compelling, we're going to basically get two economies. You're going to get the Bitcoin economy, and you're going to get the fiat economy, and there'll be a lot of overlap, but it'll be increasingly obvious, the nature, the prosperity, the dynamics, the ethics, the values of the two, the cultures associated with them even. And I think, as the Bitcoin economy grows, the distinction or the disparity or the differences between the two is going to become more and more apparent. One is going to be more conducive to efficient capital calculation and allocation, prosperity, peace, all the good feels that we get from Bitcoin, and all the principles that are inherent in Bitcoin bleeding out into economic interaction and social and cultural interaction. And I think that will become increasingly more apparent, and that will draw people in that weren't necessarily or have never necessarily cared about monetary history, economics, macroeconomic situations, none of that stuff. They just want a better life, as we all do. And they're going to look at this parallel economy and say, that's where it's to be found. And that's why I'm going to learn about this thing, adopt it to the extent that I can, and move my economic capacity or financial capacity into that, both to insulate it from what's happening in fiat land, but also to leverage what's happening in Bitcoin land for the, for the ambitions that I might have for myself. So that's my hopeful end to this conversation that might be construed as somewhat concerning to some. But gentlemen, thank you very much for the time. PA, I know it's super late for you, so I appreciate you staying up to have a
That's
chat with us guys. And this situation is unfolding and probably will be unfolding for decades to come. So maybe we should put a pin in this and get together again in 6 to 12 months and see where we're at then.
I'm not going anywhere.
All right, guys. Appreciate it. Take care.
All right.
All
Thanks,
right.
guys.
Take
Yeah.
care. Bye.
Yeah.